Grant committed much of his early years as president to Lincoln's original goals of Reconstruction, signing numerous acts ensuring naturalization and equal rights of black citizens. To enforce these acts and the new constitutional amendments, he created the Justice Department and wielded the U.S. military to stamp out the KKK and other white supremacist organizations. Sadly, Grant's presidency was wrought with political turmoil from both within his own party and without. The newly reformed governments of the southern states lashed out at the Reconstruction laws and continuously caused issues during elections. Grant found his hands tied as his second term came to an end, and the country began its return to stalemate and compromise as the economic and business interests of both parties began to usurp the social crises of Reconstruction. With the end of the American Civil War and the question of slavery at last resolved, many people within the United States continued the exodus out west, in the footsteps of the early 19th century pioneers. With the territories along the West Coast fairly well established and a growing number of cities dotting the Midwest, moving away from the chaos of the East Coast and the memory of the war was appealing. Access to the West had only grown over the course of the mid-19th century, with the introduction of the Transcontinental Railroad. From 1863 to 1869, a transcontinental railroad was built to connect the eastern and western coasts of the U.S. The very first steam train had debuted in 1830, and by 1850, more than 9,000 miles of track had been laid. In 1860, it was decided that the mountain pass where the Donner Party had been trapped was an ideal place for a railroad to cut through the Sierra Nevada mountains. When President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law in 1862, construction commenced. Though railroad workers suffered attacks from members of the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes as they progressed across the land. Wherever the railroad went, ramshackle settlements of the sort immortalized in Wild West culture were soon to follow. These places were hotbeds for drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence. When construction of the Transcontinental Railroad finished at Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake in Utah, a final spike made of 17.6 karat gold was ceremoniously driven into the ground before a crowd of workers and dignitaries. With the railroad's completion, the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States was cut from months to under a week. This made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier and increased the speed of westward expansion. As settlers entered newly accessible territories, conflicts with Native Americans increased. During this time, the exploits, both real and exaggerated, of notorious outlaws gained the perpetrators' infamy at the time, and an enduring legacy today. Wyatt Earp, former Marshal of Dodge City, Kansas, moved to Tombstone, Arizona Territory in 1879, with several of his brothers in search of riches from the silver boom. While there, the Earps ran into a gang of outlaws called the Cowboys, led by Ike Clanton. The Earps all had law enforcement backgrounds, with Virgil Earp acting as both town marshal for Tombstone and as a deputy U.S. Marshal. They teamed up with the temporary policeman Doc Holliday. The lawman had a long-standing feud with the Clanton gang, but things came to a head when Virgil made the decision to enforce a city ordinance prohibiting carrying weapons in town, which meant disarming the gun-toting cowboys. This intervention led to the shootout at the OK Corral, a 30-second gunfight that nevertheless became symbolic of the Old West, a time when the frontier was virtually lawless as a consequence of lawmen being spread incredibly thin over vast territories. The beginning of the Gilded Age, a period characterized as much by wealth and abundance as by poverty and corruption, was in fact a notable ending. The year 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction, and therefore an end to one of the greatest periods of civil rights reform in the country's history. Efforts by the federal government to help protect the rights given to African Americans after the end of the Civil War were abandoned as a result of a compromise struck to settle the contested 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Hayes, a North Republican, was granted the presidency and Reconstruction was ended. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, no longer interfering to protect African American civil and political rights. The systemic violence, disenfranchisement, and oppression that followed would persist for more than a century and come to be called Jim Crow as the federal government gave up on its promise to give free black men the rights of citizens in the South. Sharecropping and low-wage work, such as domestic servitude, were some of the only options available to freed people in the South. But depending on who you were, what you looked like, and where in the country you were, economic opportunity could abound in Gilded Age America. Cheap land and relatively high wages compared to other parts of the world drew in immigrants by the millions. Between 1877 and 1900, approximately 7.3 million people immigrated into the United States. Prior to 1880, most came from Western Europe and China. But closer to the turn of the century, more immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. They settled in every area of the country in large numbers, except for the economically devastated South. But their appearance triggered political and social backlash from Americans who felt their white, Protestant country was being threatened. Movements to resist certain types of immigrants, including Catholics, Jews, and Chinese, gained momentum. In the West, sentiments against Chinese workers were particularly hostile, and mobs were known to gather and attack Chinese people living in areas of Wyoming and Washington, driving them out. Congress restricted Chinese immigration to the U.S. beginning in 1892, continuing to uphold the policy until a permanent exclusion policy was enacted in 1902. Fear of minority groups festered among white Americans after the Reconstruction period, and was only further fueled by the influx of immigration, leading to anti-democratic efforts to restrict certain groups from voting. As immigrants flooded into the country, many of them went west. As a result of the Homestead and Railroad Acts of 1862, the federal government had handed most of the lands owned by the Native Americans over to railroad corporations and white farmers, including immigrants. The Homestead Act did not require American citizenship, and the railroad sold land grants at low prices, even going so far as to advertise in Europe. Advances in technology, such as improved plow designs, meant just one family could officially farm a large area of land without need for intensive effort or hired labor. But not all farmers were happy. Increasingly, political movements like populism were drawing in hard-pressed wheat farmers of the Midwest and resentful white cotton farmers in the South who were fed up with wealthy elites, monopolistic corporate interests, and gold. Nevertheless, farming became so efficient that the country was producing more food than it could consume, so the excess was exported. This was all made possible by the expansion of railroads that had occurred in the 1850s and 60s, for they made previously inaccessible land much more feasible and profitable to work. Between 1865 and 1898, America's output of wheat increased by 256%, corn by 222%, coal by 800%, and the miles of railway track by 567%. The nation's economy revolved around the railroads, which trucked commodities like wheat, cattle, silver, and timber from place to place. The first transcontinental railroad opened in 1869, and railroads were a rapidly expanding area of the new economy. By 1890, nearly 800,000 people worked for a railroad. However, railway work was poorly paid and often dangerous. Even as wages were rising and quality of living for skilled workers in America was outpacing that for those in England, mechanization was steadily replacing those skilled workers with unskilled ones who could be paid less. The distribution of wealth in the Gilded Age America was highly unequal, with the top 10% owning more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth. This disparity, along with the poor working conditions that affected the everyday lives of wage workers, inspired a number of vicious worker strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted 52 days before it had to be put down by federal troops and the National Guard, but only after the fighting had resulted in over 100 deaths and workers having burned several railroad cars and engines. Another big railroad strike occurred in 1886, involving more than 200,000 labor union workers. On May 4, 1886, a gathering at Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest police brutality against striking workers turned into a riot when someone threw a bomb at police officers trying to disperse the crowd. In the ensuing chaos, 7 police officers and 1 protester died. Searching for those responsible, police in Chicago and elsewhere rounded up radicals, labor organizers, and anti-capitalists, selecting 8 men who were tried and convicted for the events at Haymarket Square. Though some found the trial's evidence to be weak and saw the convicted men, most of whom were given the death sentence, as martyrs, for many others the takeaway from this event was heightened anti-labor sentiment. Nevertheless, efforts to improve labor rights continued. In the Pullman Strike of 1894, widespread striking and boycotting severely disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest. The strike occurred in response to pay cuts that the Pullman Palace Railroad Car Company made to its workers' already low wages. The company did not, however, correspondingly reduce rents and other costs in its company's town of Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, where the majority of its workers lived in company housing. Workers and their families were starving, but the company's president refused to make any changes and ordered those that complained to be fired. The workers decided to strike. Some of the workers belonged to the American Railway Union, and union delegates found a way to support the strike. ARU members across the country would boycott the Pullman Company, refusing to hitch Pullman-made cars to trains and unhitching any Pullman cars already attached. The strategy, masterminded by ARU president and future U.S. presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, soon had 125,000 workers on 29 railroads quitting work rather than handle Pullman cars.